Hi, I'm Jess Flanigan from the University of Richmond, and today I'm going to talk about the pronatalist case for reproductive freedom. The argument that I'm going to talk about today comes from a book I'm working on called The Ethics of Expecting. In that book, I argue that pregnancy is supererogatory, meaning that it's good, but it's not required. I think that having a baby is really morally good. Think about all of the great things that you've experienced in your life. That's possible because somebody created you. At the same time, I think that people who provide life-saving gestational services, we might say, by which I mean people who are pregnant women, are not morally required to remain pregnant just because of the enormous good that they're doing. It's not an enforceable requirement. People aren't liable to be legally required to stay pregnant, even though having a baby is a really great thing that you can do with your life. That's the argument of the book. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit more narrowly about the pronatalist part of the book and how that relates to the part of the book that talks about reproductive freedom. So let's just jump in with an overview of what the argument is going to be. I'm arguing that having a child is supererogatory, meaning that we should think about it kind of like giving to charity. I'm going to address two different kinds of pronatalists and argue that both kinds of pronatalists should support reproductive freedom. First, I'll argue from a Christian perspective that a Christian ethic should not support policies that criminalize or punish pregnant women. And then I'll argue that pragmatic pronatalists should not support policies that increase the cost of being pregnant for women. But before we jump in, let's talk a little bit more about what I mean when I say that pregnancy is supererogatory. Think about an analogy to charitable giving. If you gave enough money to charity for effective causes like anti-malarial bed nets, you could provide life-saving assistance to a child under the age of 5. You could really help somebody in need. You could use your property to provide life-saving assistance that's going to mean that a child lives a whole life worth living that she wouldn't have otherwise lived, but for your assistance. Being pregnant is like that. What it is to be pregnant is to be supporting a whole life that wouldn't otherwise exist but for the assistance that the mother provides by continuing the pregnancy. And that's so morally good. But in the same way that people shouldn't go to jail if they decide to halt their charitable donations, similarly, I don't think that people who decide to end their pregnancies, terminate their pregnancies by having an abortion, or even people who make risky choices in pregnancy that result in miscarriage should in any way be liable to criminal sanctions and penalties because they, at some point in the pregnancy, refrained from continuing the pregnancy, thus refraining from providing life-saving assistance to a child in need. That's what I mean when I say that pregnancy is like charitable giving. It's really, really good thing to do, and it's a great way for you to use the resources you have, but people who decide not to do it or who decide to stop doing it shouldn't be subjected to any kinds of political sanctions. At this point, somebody might be wondering, well, what do I even mean when I'm talking about reproductive freedom? I mean, after all, public officials regulate reproduction in all sorts of ways. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of what I mean by this. The first is people should have access to contraception. So they should be able to control the timing of their pregnancies by using birth control, for example. I think also people should have access to abortion. So if people want to terminate their pregnancies for any kind of reason, I think that they should be allowed to decide that they no longer want to use their bodies to sustain the life of a child. In some contexts, women can be subjected to criminal penalties for prenatal injury or fetal endangerment. In these cases, they could be subject to legal penalties, for example, that would compromise their parental rights for their other children or require them to go into compulsory substance use treatment if public officials think that a person's behavior endangers the life of an unborn child. These policies are also restrictions on women's reproductive freedom. At the time of birth, there are restrictions on women's obstetric autonomy. For example, policies in hospitals that prohibit vaginal birth after cesarean restrict women's rights to decide the conditions under which they give birth, and that's also a limitation on their reproductive freedom. I also think that a way of limiting reproductive freedom would be regulations on IVF or regulations on commercial surrogacy, which prevent some families from forming the family that they want under the conditions that they want out of either concerns about the ethical use of IVF or labor practices with commercial surrogacy. Additionally, things like restrictions on pre-implantation genetic screening or non-invasive prenatal screening for disability are restrictions on reproductive freedom to the extent that they prevent parents from choosing the conditions of their own reproductive decision-making. And after the child is born, we might also think of policies that mandate that men provide child support as restrictions on reproductive freedom because they prevent men from having a say in the decision about whether or not they're going to become fathers or not. Now, Christians are often divided when it comes to different kinds of legal restrictions about reproductive choice. And some Christians identify as politically pro-life. By this I mean that if a person's politically pro-life, they support policies that require people to remain pregnant. And typically their argument for a politically pro-life position is that a fetus or an unborn child has a soul, it has moral status, and that moral status entitles it to the continued gestation, the continued pregnancy from a mother. There are a lot of arguments on both sides of the abortion debate, but what I want to do for now is to just bracket those types of questions and say, let's grant that a fetus has moral status and that by remaining pregnant, the child's mother, the baby's mother, assistance to the child. And think about pregnancy as an act of Samaritanism. What should Christians think about Samaritanism? Well, we all know the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus says to be a neighbor is to put aside your own self-interest to provide life-saving assistance to the person in need. But now think about the priest and the Levite who cross on the other side of the road in the parable. At any point, does the gospel say, and for those people who declined to provide life-saving assistance when they could have, when they were in a position to, should they be subject to sanctions from Rome? No. The principle of Samaritanism from the Gospels is a principle of what you ought to do, not what you should be legally required to do. And indeed, throughout the Gospels, it's very clear that law enforcement is not morally reliable, and it's often extremely violent and punitive. And so we should be very, very skeptical of any kind of policy that empowers public officials in the form of law enforcement to interfere with people in a punitive way, to mandate that they provide assistance to people in need, in the way that we should have a general presumptive skepticism towards the violence of the state. Zooming out a bit, there are a lot of other contexts where we recognize that public officials cannot violate people's bodily integrity in order to force them to provide life-saving assistance or rescue services to a person in need, even if the people in need do have moral status and have a very, very strong claim to assistance. So think about, for example, the injustice of conscription in the case of an emergency or a humanitarian catastrophe. We don't support a kidney tax, even if the government could have a kidney lottery where they confiscated a bunch of people's kidneys for a national kidney bank to redistribute it to the people who were suffering from kidney disease. You would think, you know what? I have a right to my kidney, even if my kidney could be used to save the life of somebody in need. Imagine, for example, that every month a doctor were going to put a pencil up your nose, and it would kind of be a little bit uncomfortable and it would be inconvenient for you to have to go to the appointment, but something about that pencil procedure, having a pencil stuck up your nose, would, over the course of a year, save one person's life. It would be really nice for you to go to the doctor's office every month and have a pencil stuck up your nose. But if that doesn't sound like something that you're willing to do, even though it's only moderately costly and a little bit uncomfortable for you, you would be well within your rights to say, you know what, I'm not going to consent to the pencil procedure, even if it would save the life of a person in need. Similarly with the charitable giving, even if you had enough money to buy enough bed nets to save the life of a child in need, it would be wrong for me to steal that money or to mug you in some way and say, you know what, I'm going to force you to provide this charitable assistance to somebody in need. Because even if you have moral reason to do it, it's still your money and it would be wrong for me to coercively take that from you, even if I were going to put it to better ends. All of these types of cases are supposed to illustrate the idea that we already agree that just because somebody can provide life-saving assistance to a person in need doesn't mean that they're liable to be interfered with by public officials or being punished when they fail to provide that life-saving assistance. So why would we treat pregnancy any differently? Now I'm going to turn to the more pragmatic pronatalists. I think some people are pronatalists who oppose reproductive freedom because they think that reproductive freedom would have antinatalist consequences. After all, people using contraception or having abortions means that they're, in some sense, choosing not to create children or prevent themselves from getting pregnant and creating children. However, that's only part of the story. We also have to think about the long-term effects of a policy regime that increases the opportunity cost of pregnancy relative to the opportunity cost of not getting pregnant. So when a person decides to become pregnant, look at this side of the screen for the pregnant person, it's already a risky, difficult experience for a lot of women. If it were the kind of activity that also subjected a person to criminal sanctions, legal punishments, or any kind of blame, it would only make it more costly and less appealing for women to become pregnant in the first place. So by having policies that restrict women's reproductive freedom, those policies increase the health risks associated with pregnancy by, in some cases, making it so women cannot access effective reproductive care for example, ectopic pregnancies. It also increases the cost of pregnancy by making it so that women would, by being pregnant, forfeit some of their own medical autonomy because doctors would adopt a dual patient standard where women's own decisions about their bodies would be weighed against a physician's judgment about the well-being of their future child. Additionally, policies that would limit women's reproductive freedom when it came to their ability to decide whether or not to continue a pregnancy could put a really excessive and undue strain on a family's resources. A legal regime that criminalizes or has legal penalties attached to pregnancy also would express a view of pregnancy that would make all pregnant women experience social sanctions for any perceived risks that they took during pregnancy, which would mean that pregnancy would become a kind of high-risk, socially sanctioned activity that would be less appealing for women who are considering it. Legal sanctions, of course, are a significant penalty. If women have any kind of threat of incarceration or criminal penalties, that would significantly increase the cost associated with pregnancy for everybody. Additionally, in some cases, limitations on reproductive choice could be enforced against women who are already parents, thus meaning that getting pregnant and having an additional child would potentially compromise a person's parental rights or undermine their family stability. If you value family stability, that's why you should value reproductive freedom for women. All of these costs are relevant to the pragmatic pronatalist case for reproductive freedom. Restrictions on reproductive freedom don't necessarily translate to larger families because people can exercise their reproductive freedom, for example, by using contraception or by even ending pregnancies while still realizing their desired fertility eventually. Pragmatic pronatalists should focus instead on making it so that people desire to have larger families so that their fertility preferences are higher. How could we make it so people have higher fertility preferences? Well, the first thing to do would be to support women in high fertility populations already. Instead of making it seem like pregnancy is a high-risk, morally fraught obligation that could potentially subject them to social stigma and legal penalties, pregnancy should be celebrated the way that we celebrate people who give to charity, people who run into burning buildings to provide a rescue to somebody, or anyone else who's using their body and taking a risk to provide life-saving assistance. I think that pronatalists should really value women's reproductive labor instead of denigrating it and making it subject to suspicion and surveillance. The second thing that pragmatic pronatalists should do to increase people's desired fertility is to reach out to lower fertility populations and to express to them that this is a really valuable thing that they could do. If a person's on the fence about starting a family or about having an additional kid, a policy landscape that increases the cost of pregnancy is going to be a policy landscape that prevents them from deciding, you know what, I am going to increase the number of kids that I desire to have. Summing up, I've argued that both Christian pronatalists and pragmatic pronatalists should support reproductive freedom. I agree that there are very compelling reasons for people to continue their pregnancies in most cases. But the fact that there's a lot of good that a person could achieve by staying pregnant doesn't mean that she should be legally required to do it. Legal restrictions on reproductive freedom are counterproductive, and they're unfairly burdensome to the women who become pregnant. Thank you for listening to the Pronatalist Case for Reproductive Freedom.